we are at another pivotal moment in the war in Ukraine. And I'd like to lay out my comments in terms of short-term, mid-term, and long-term imperatives. In the short term, as the ministers converge on Brussels for yet another ministerial gathering, it is crucial to recognize the threat right now of the ongoing Russian offensive to seize the rest of Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts. And therefore, there has to be a real focus on rushing the ammunition, other material, and supplies to Ukraine to enable them to conduct successful defensive operations, perhaps grudgingly giving up some small amounts of territory that are seized by the Russians in very costly operations. I'm sure that the listeners will have seen the UK Ministry of Defense observing that the losses in recent days have been over 850 Russian soldiers per day, something that even for Russia, even for a country that still thinks that it can outsuffer the Ukrainians, Europeans, and Americans, is unsustainable. Midterm, the imperative is, of course, to micromanage now, getting to Ukraine, the tanks that have been committed, the infantry fighting vehicles, the longer range precision munitions, the additional air defenses, and again, further ammunition, other wheeled armored vehicles, etc., as well as the training on them, not just for those who will operate them, but also for those who will maintain them, noting that that's often the more challenging task than that of actually operating, and the logistical supply chain, the iron mountains of spare parts and components and so forth, often plug in, plug out kinds of components for the more sophisticated elements of some of these Western armored vehicles. All of this is crucial to enable Ukraine to be ready by May, early June, whenever it is that they decide to conduct their own counteroffensive, hopefully to cut the land bridge that currently connects Russia proper to Crimea, to establish and then to isolate those forces that are on the western side of that, and to make life much more difficult for Ukraine, and to put within range of the new longer range systems that are provided for the high mobility artillery rocket system, now the ground launched small diameter bomb, which will be 150 kilometers precision munition and a larger warhead than the current one, to start to put some of those bases, headquarters and barracks and so forth, logistical depots in Crimea within range, put them at risk as well. And then long term, it's time for the ministers at Brussels to recognize certain imperatives that are just going to happen. There has to be a transition for Ukraine from Eastern Bloc aircraft, fighter bombers, MiG-29s, and so forth, to Western fighter bombers, because there are no more Eastern Bloc systems. The Eastern European countries that had those, by and large, those that were operationally ready, have been transitioning them to Ukraine, and over time, Ukraine is running out of those as well. They can only cannibalize so much. They literally have more pilots now than they have aircraft. And so at least deciding to allow the training of these pilots, and once again, the very important component of the mechanics and those who will have to maintain these aircraft, getting that going, even as they may defer the decision for some time to the specific numbers and specific type of aircraft, whether F-16, Eurofighter, or others. But this kind of decision-making has to go forward. And there also has to be a greater focus on what will the Marshall-like reconstruction plan consist of, who will lead it, presumably the US, G7, EU, and so on, but getting serious about that, and also what will be hugely important and really the ultimate foundation that will be necessary for successful reconstruction of the damaged infrastructure in Ukraine, and that is, of course, an ironclad security guarantee, whether it is NATO membership, which even individuals who used to be concerned about the sensitivities in the Kremlin now say it is required. Dr. Henry Kissinger, in fact, has said that it's now appropriate to begin thinking about NATO membership. And if that's not possible because of one or more of the members of NATO, then it should be a U.S.-led coalition of the willing. But without an ironclad security guarantee, that reconstruction plan won't be successful at the point when there are meaningful negotiations. And that's the final point. We have to do everything we can, again, short, medium term, long term, to enable Ukraine to hasten the moment when Vladimir Putin recognizes that this war is unsustainable on the battlefield because of the horrific losses that Russians are taking, even noting they think they can outsuffer, again, the Ukrainians, Europeans, and Americans. We have to prove him wrong in that regard. He's not going to be able to do to them what the Russian Empire did to Napoleon's army or the USSR did to the Nazis. We've got to ensure that, again, they can make this a reality on the battlefield. And meanwhile, the U.S.-led Western coalition also has to tighten the financial, economic, and personal sanctions and export controls to make it very clear that the damage on the home front in Russia, which has already been set back by at least a decade with the loss of over 1,200 U.S. and Western firms or drawdown of them, that message has to get through so that there can be meaningful negotiations. I tend to believe that this will be ultimately the way this will end will be with a negotiated resolution. We have to hasten that moment when Vladimir Putin is willing to enter into meaningful negotiations, at which time, again, Ukraine can start to think seriously about reconstruction with our help and also an ironclad security guarantee. Look, I think right now we've got to see what is necessary to help them hold off the Russian offensive. And I suspect that in this regard, this will be more ammunition. It will be helping to maintain the systems that we have already provided with spare parts and components and so forth. There will be a number of battlefield requirements. It may even be refined fuel products. Again, medical assistance. They need to identify these to us. I'm confident that that is happening. Actually, there is a headquarters that is established, a 3-star headquarters established in Germany, U.S.-led, that is doing just that. Certainly, the decision-making now to provide advanced systems later on, I think, would be useful. And in that regard, let me just transition quickly to what will be needed later, as I mentioned, to help the Ukrainians achieve combined arms operations. So with something that Russia has not been able to accomplish. In other words, not just driving tanks down roads, but then to support them with infantry that keeps the enemy's infantry with anti-tank guided missiles off of them, artillery, mortars that suppress the enemy, engineers and EOD that reduce obstacles and defuse explosives, air defense to keep the enemy's rotary and fixed wing air support off you, your own air support to the extent that you have it, electronic warfare to jam the enemy, good command control communications, good logistics, all of this. Again, Ukraine and we together, just as happened before, it's publicly known that we wargamed the offensive in Kharkiv that was so highly successful. And they achieved a real maneuver warfare capability there that I think they can duplicate this time, noting that the defenses will be stronger against what it is likely that they will want to do. But we need to enable them to achieve combined arms operations and then to sustain them. That will be the difference between what the Ukrainians can do compared with what the Russians have been able to do. Certainly over time, again, there's no question about the imperative of Western aircraft. There's no question about, I think, even longer range precision munitions, but let's get the ground launched small diameter bomb in there first. But then there are some other requirements that I think do deserve additional attention, in particular, augmenting the air and ballistic missile and counter unmanned aerial system, early warning and defense, and trying to integrate that, make it more comprehensive to the extent that is possible, noting the challenges of trying to defend infrastructure across the country and the need, therefore, to prioritize the limited assets that they have. I think also getting serious about more advanced drones with better intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities and precision munitions, Hellfires, whatever, would be a huge contribution as well. But once again, what we're talking about are near-term requirements that have to be provided and near-term decisions that can enable longer-term capabilities. And then over the midterm, as I mentioned, trying to identify what else do they need to ensure the success of the offensive that will be launched, according to the Ukrainians and all other observers, in the late May, June, summer timeframe.